Chapter 1. A Tale of Two Warbosses. The sun sank behind the jagged peaks of the Badlands, casting long shadows across the blood-stained dirt of the Waaagh camp. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, squig meat, and old battle wounds as orcs gathered in a massive circle, some sharpening their choppas, others punching each other for fun. In the center of it all, standing atop a mound of skulls and discarded armor, were two of the biggest, meanest, and loudest warbosses the Badlands had ever seen. On one side, clad in mismatched plates of rusted iron, was Gorgruk Eadbasha, the warboss of the Red Skulls. A towering brute with a face full of scars and a tusk cracked clean in half, he carried a massive spiked club that had seen more dwarven heads than most axes in the old world. Gorgruk was known for his incomparable smashing skills, and a temper so short it could make a squig look patient. His Red Skulls were a horde of bellowing mad lads who lived for one thing: crumping everything in sight. Opposite him, leaning on a choppa as wide as a man was tall, was Grimgutz Irontoof, the boss of the Iron Stompas. His heavy, iron-plated boots dug deep into the dirt, and his jagged armor made him look more like a walking fortress than an orc. His teeth, what remained of them, were sharpened into points, and his bellowing laugh could shatter the confidence of any lesser boss. The Iron Stompas were known for crushing things underfoot, be it Humy cities, goblin rebellions, or rival orcs who didn't know their place. And right now the two biggest, meanest orcs in the camp were screaming at each other. "I'm the biggest and best," roared Gorgruk, pounding his chest with his massive green fist. "Ain't no one's got more Waaagh in 'em than me." "Yarskull's too empty to hold a proper Waaagh, hey," Grimgutz bellowed back, shoving his way through a cluster of orcs. "It's me who's got the biggest Waaagh energy. Look at me, lads. Look at me loot. Look at me teeth. Teeth don't mean nothing when you're too stupid to use 'em," Gorgruk spat. The gathered orcs erupted into laughter, some of them mimicking Grimgutz's toothy grin in exaggerated fashion. The warboss of the Iron Stompas snarled and immediately swung his massive choppa at Gorgruk's head. The clash that followed was nothing short of legendary. "They biggest boss bust up." The two warbosses crashed into each other like charging squigs, weapons meeting with the force of a thunderclap. The shockwave sent goblins sprawling and knocked lesser orcs flat on their backs. Gorgruk swung his massive club, aiming to cave in Grimgutz's armored skull, but the Iron Stompas boss caught it with his choppa, locking the weapons together in a brutal test of strength. "Your breath stinks, you dung-eaten git," Grimgutz snarled through clenched teeth. "That's the smell of a proper orc, you iron-plated numpty," Gorgruk retorted, wrenching his weapon free and headbutting Grimgutz square in the nose. The crowd roared as the fight escalated. Fists, kicks, bites, and more headbutts flew in every direction. Armor dented, tusks cracked, and by the time they'd traded enough blows to fell an ogre, both warbosses were gasping, leaning on their weapons for support. Still, neither one had fallen. The gathered orcs stamped their feet, shouting and jeering. Some placed bets. Others just laughed at how evenly matched the two idiots were. Even the goblins, usually trying to avoid getting stomped, peeked out from their hiding spots, eager to see who would claim victory. Finally, Gorgruk spat out a broken tooth and scowled. "This is getting us nowhere." "Aye." Grimgutz wiped a stream of blood from his busted lip. "If we keep fighting, we'll just end up too mashed up to lead our lads." They both glared at each other for a long moment. The Red Skull's orcs watched their boss, and the Iron Stompas did the same for theirs. Then, at the exact same time, both bosses had the same dumb idea. "Oi," Gorgruk grinned, rubbing the bruise forming on his jaw. "If we can't crump each other, we'll have to prove who's the best. Some other way." Grimgutz's face twisted into a grin that revealed way too many teeth. "Aye. A big bet. Aye. Something real proper." Hajit contest da Badlands has ever seen. Both bosses turned to the crowd, throwing their arms wide. What? Gorgruk bellowed. We's gonna have a competition. The orcs roared in approval. 10 challenges, Grimgutz added. The winner gets to call himself the best war boss in all the Badlands. Gorgruk smirked. Dalosa has to give up all his best loot, his biggest lads, and his best squigs. The crowd exploded in a frenzy of excitement. The goblins, sensing incoming chaos, started scampering for cover. Even the Black Orcs in the back, usually too serious for this nonsense, gave nods of approval. Grimgutz and Gorgruk locked eyes one final time, their grins widening. Both had just signed up for the most ridiculous series of challenges the Warhammer world had ever seen, and neither of them were about to back down. Chapter 2: The Rules of the Big Bet. The morning after the great boss bust-up, the orc camp was still buzzing with excitement. Weapons were being sharpened, bets were being placed, and every orc, goblin, and squig knew that something big was about to go down. Right in the middle of the war camp, a massive circle of the biggest, meanest orcs from both tribes had formed around a giant, wobbly wooden table, a thing looted from some unfortunate empire village and reinforced with goblin labor, which meant it was mostly held together with squig spit and blind faith. Seated at one end was Gorgruk Eadbasha, his boots kicked up on the table as he idly picked his teeth with a snapped-off dagger. At the other end, leaning forward with his tusks bared, was Grimgutz Irontoof, drumming his iron-plated fingers on the wood. Between them sat the shamans, the biggest bosses, and the ugliest bruisers of both tribes, all here to establish the rules of the biggest bet in orcish history. The rules of Krumpen. Gorgruk slammed a fist on the table, sending tankards and goblins flying. Oi, before we get to the Krumpen, we gotta set our rules. Grimgutz nodded, rubbing his massive chin. Hey, no sneaky gobbo trickery. This has to be a proper contest. One of the goblin bosses opened his mouth to protest, but a nearby orc immediately punched him unconscious, which seemed to settle the matter. One of the shamans, Weirdshank Dwarfs, raised his bony hands. His eyes were already glowing green with Waaagh energy, and he had the classic half-crazed look of a green-skinned wizard who had seen one too many warp-fueled explosions. "We's doing this proper-like," he muttered. "Then it's gotta be 10 rounds. 10 big events, each more Krumpen than the last. No running away, no cheating, and—" He paused, no stabbing to referees. The orcs collectively groaned. "What?" shouted one of the bruisers. "Then what's the point of having referees?" "Because," Weirdshank growled, "if you lot kill 'em all, then who's gonna remember who wins?" That seemed to make sense. Gorgruk smirked. "Winner o' the most contests gets all the loot, all the biggest lads, and all the best squigs. Loser as to join the winner's Waaagh, and follow orders like a stinkin' runt." Grimgutz spat into his palm and held out his hand. "Deal." Gorgruk spat back and grabbed his rival's hand. The force of their handshake cracked the table straight down the middle, sending goblins scrambling out of the way. Snick-snagged Screeb. Of course, with such an important event, they needed a record-keeper, someone to write down da rules, da results, and da occasional accusations of cheatin'. That's when everyone turned to Snicksnag. Snicksnag was a tiny, scrawny grot with a nose too big for his face and a permanent look of fear in his beady red eyes. He was technically a scribe, which meant he had somehow learned to scratch symbols into paper without immediately eating it. Unfortunately for him, this meant he was chosen as da official record keeper of da Great Bet, which was about the worst job an orc could give to a grot. "We need someone to write everything down," Grimgutz announced, grabbing Snicksnag by the scruff of his neck and slamming him onto the table. Snicksnag squeaked, his quill and ink pot clattering to the ground. "But "But boss, I ain't fast at writing, right?" "Shut up and do it, you runt," Gorgruk growled, kicking him in the ribs for emphasis. "Yes, boss. Right away, boss," Snicksnag gasped, fumbling for his quill. He dipped it into a suspicious-looking black puddle, probably not ink, and started scratching words onto a piece of Empire parchment he'd stolen earlier. DA official rules of DA Big Bad. 10 rounds. No cheatin'. No running away. The winner gets the loser's best loot, biggest lads, and best squigs. Loser must join the winner's Waaagh and follow orders like a grot. No stabbin' dare referees, unless they really deserve it. The results are final, unless they ain't. Snicksnag scratched the last rule down, hoping no one would notice. As soon as he finished, Gorgruk grabbed the parchment, looked at it for 3 seconds, and then punched Snicksnag across the camp. "Looks good to me. Da first challenge is decided." With the rules settled, it was time to decide the first event. Gorgruk leaned forward, sneering. "So, you tin-headed git, what's first?" Grimgutz grinned. "Gotta start simple. DA biggest Waaagh, shout." The orcs cheered and immediately started yelling at random, just to get in the mood. The goblins screamed in terror, assuming the fight had already started. Weirdchank the shaman stomped his staff down, silencing the rabble. "Dat means dis evening, we gathers up de boys, and de 2 bosses let out de biggest Waaagh. Shout de can. Whoever shakes de ground hardest wins." "Pah, this'll be easy," Gorgruk laughed. "I once shouted so loud, the homie town I was raiding fell over." Grimgutz cracked his knuckles. "Dat's nothing. I once yelled so loud a squig exploded." Both warbosses stood up at the same time, glaring each other down. The entire camp erupted into chaos. Orcs already placing bets, goblins trying to run for cover, and shamans warming up their Waaagh magic just in case things got too loud. Snicksnag, barely recovering from being punted across the camp, whimpered and scribbled furiously. The Great Orc-Off had begun. Chapter 3. The first fight. The biggest Waaagh, shout. Shout. As the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of the Badlands, the entire orc camp gathered at the foot of a rocky cliff, eager to witness the first great challenge of the Big Bet. Fires burned high, casting twisted shadows as orcs, goblins, and even a few particularly enthusiastic squigs crowded around the makeshift shoutin' stage, which was really just a flat area between 2 boulders with plenty of space to yell at full volume without immediately starting a riot. Not that it would stop one from happening. On one side, Gorgruk Eadbasha of the Red Skulls stood tall, thumping his chest, his muscle-bound frame silhouetted against the firelight. Behind him, his lads chanted his name, shaking their weapons and headbutting each other in encouragement. On the opposite side, Grimgutz Irontoof of the Iron Stompas cracked his knuckles, his jagged iron boots digging into the dirt. His boys were just as loud, stomping the ground in rhythm, each impact making the goblins in the crowd jump and scatter. In the middle of the gathering, Weirdchank de Wazard raised his gnarled staff. "Right," he bellowed. "Da rules is simple. Each warboss gets 1 shout. Whoever makes da biggest, loudest, wariest noise wins." The orcs cheered, goblins cowered, and squigs snarled in confusion. Snicksnag, still clutching his parchment from earlier, trembled as he prepared to record the results. He knew this was not just any contest. This was a battle of brute lungs and brainless pride. And it was about to get real loud. Round 1, Gorgruk Eadbasha. Gorgruk stretched his massive green arms, cracked his neck, and grinned. "It'll be easy." He stomped forward, planted his feet, clenched his fists, and inhaled so deeply that the firelight flickered as the air got sucked toward him. The crowd leaned in, waiting for what they knew was going to be a truly legendary bellow. Then, with the force of a rampaging wyvern, Gorgruk let loose. Waaagh. The sheer volume of it shook the ground. Squigs panicked, bolting in random directions. Goblins fell over from the shockwave. Some of the weaker orcs clutched their ears, howling in pain. The Red Skull's orcs whooped and hollered, banging their weapons together, knowing that this was a cry that could lead an entire Waaagh to victory. Dust and pebbles rained down from the cliff face. Even Weirdchank looked momentarily impressed, nodding as he recorded the effect. "That was a proper Waaagh. Shut!" he muttered, scratching symbols onto his parchment. "Shoot the ground, scared the gobos. Yeah, it's a good one." Gorgruk grinned, crossing his arms. "Let's see you beat that, you boot-faced git." Grimgutz cracked his knuckles again, stretching his jaw like he was preparing to bite reality itself. And then he inhaled, and he inhaled, and he kept inhaling. The crowd fell silent, watching as Grimgutz's massive lungs swelled to unnatural proportions. Weirdchank's eyes twitched as he felt the raw Waaagh energy building. And then, the force of Grimgutz's war cry wasn't just loud, it was cataclysmic. The earth shook, the fires flickered and died, the squigs exploded. And most importantly, the cliff face above them rumbled. The orcs froze, their battle-hardened brains struggling to process what was happening. Cracks splintered across the rock wall, and then, with a deafening roar that drowned out even the echoes of the shout, the entire top of the cliff broke loose. The biggest Waaagh ever heard. "Appalachie!" someone screamed. Boulders, rocks, and unlucky goblins rained down on the battlefield. Orcs scattered in every direction. Some dived into the dirt, others tried, and failed, to punch falling rocks. Gorgruk, having just watched his own incredible Waaagh shout get completely outclassed, barely had time to process the wall of falling stone rushing toward him. "Why, that ain't fair." Look. A massive boulder smashed down, flattening Gorgruk into the dirt with a sickening crunch. When the dust settled, the battlefield was a scene of utter destruction. The ground was littered with half-buried orcs, dazed squigs, and a single goblin running in circles screaming incoherently. In the middle of it all, Grimgutz stood victorious, his arms crossed and a smug grin on his face. Weirdchank, having barely survived by using a goblin as a shield, coughed up a mouthful of dust and scribbled the result down. Mine shout causes an avalanche. First time that's happened." The aftermath. Eventually, a very angry, very battered Gorgruk crawled out of the rubble, snarling and spitting out dust. "Dat don't count," he bellowed, shaking his fist. "Dat wasn't a shout. Dat was a bleedin' natural disaster." Grimgutz grinned, flashing his sharpened tusks. "What? You mad dat I shouted so that I broke the whole mountain?" The Red Skull's orcs looked between their boss and the collapsed cliff. They weren't exactly the smartest bunch, but even they knew when something was obvious. One of them scratched his chin. "Gotta say, boss, that was a pretty big Waaagh," Gorgruk snarled. His pride was on the line, and he wouldn't let Grimgutz get the last laugh. With a shake of his head, he stepped forward, dusted himself off, and jabbed a finger at his rival. "Aye, you won this round," he admitted through gritted teeth. "But that just means I'm gonna win the next." The crowd exploded into cheers, excited for the next ridiculous contest. "Off, Warpath," Weirdchank bellowed, turning to Weirdchank. "Write this down. DA next event is gonna be Stunty Krapin." The orcs cheered louder. The goblins immediately started looting the unconscious. And Snicksnag, still trapped under a pile of fallen debris, whimpered as he scratched down the next event in the record book. Chapter 4. Smashin' Stunties, Dwarf Hunting Contest. The next morning, as the dust from the biggest Waaagh shout settled, the Red Skulls and the Iron Stompaws gathered again, this time with an even greater thirst for crumpen. Gorgruk, still bruised and covered in dust from the previous night's avalanche, was not in the mood to lose another round. He stomped up to the middle of the camp, shoving aside a few unlucky goblins. "Right," he bellowed. "Da next contest is stunting crumpen." The orcs cheered. There was nothing an orc loved more than crumpen dwarfs. Grimgutz grinned, showing off his still intact teeth, something that definitely annoyed Gorgruk. "'Twas once simple," Grimgutz said, cracking his knuckles. "We both send our biggest lads to raid da stunties in Karak Duras. Whoever comes back with the best loot wins." Gorgruk nodded. "No running away, no sneaky gobbo tricks, just good honest orcy lootin'. The stunty hunt begins." By noon, 2 raiding parties were assembled. Gorgruk's Red Skulls sent their hardest, toughest choppas, led by Big Rocka, a notorious orc who once headbutted a troll unconscious. Grimgutz's Iron Stumpers went with the biggest, stompiest lads, under the command of Lugnut de Boot, a massive brute, famous for kicking squigs like they was footballs. The warbosses watched from a nearby hilltop as their boys charged toward Karak Duras, a stout, stone-built dwarf stronghold, with thunderous war cries and the distinct sound of goblins being used as distractions. Gorgruk's lads, the best looters. Big Rocka led a brutal charge straight into the dwarven gate, smashing down the first few unlucky guards. His boys looted anything they could grab: gold, axes, kegs of beer, and even a cart full of stunty helmets. They tore through dwarf storage chambers, throwing everything into sacks, or just eating it on the spot, if it looked tasty enough. At one point, Big Rocka even ripped a dwarven vault door off its hinges and used it as a shield while his boys ransacked a treasury filled with gems, coins, and fancy beards. By the time they staggered out, they were overflowing with stolen loot. Grimgutz's lads. Damad lads. Meanwhile, Lugnut de Boot and his boys did things a little differently. Instead of going for gold, they smashed their way into the dwarves' workshop, looking for the biggest thing we can carry. And what they found was a fully loaded dwarven cannon. "The dish thing's big," Lugnut grunted, scratching his head. "Yeah," said another orc. "But how we going to move it?" Lugnut kicked the cannon and it accidentally went off, blasting a hole through the ceiling. Every orc in the room looked at each other. Then they all grinned. "Well, take it the biggest shooty thing." Luntisha roared, with a lot of grunting, lifting, and using goblins as makeshift wheels. The iron stompas hauled the entire cannon out of Karak Duras, dragging it through the dirt and smashing everything in their way. Da results: cannon catastrophe. By the time both war bands returned, the war bosses were ready to judge. Gorgruk stood proudly as Big Rocka dumped a mountain of stolen dwarf loot at his feet: gold, weapons, fancy armor, barrels of ale, and a sack full of beards. "Look at all day," Gorgruk bellowed. "Ain't no stunties gonna be wearing their fancy hats now." The Red Skulls roared in approval. Grimgutz, however, simply grinned and pointed. Behind him, Lugnut's lads dragged the giant dwarven cannon into the camp. It creaked and groaned, still covered in soot and probably loaded with something explosive. The orcs stared at it. Even Gorgruk had to admit it was pretty impressive. "Yeah, I brought a cannon," he muttered. "That's right," Grimgutz said smugly, patting the iron barrel. "Now we got the biggest boomstick in the Badlands." Gorgruk gritted his teeth. He hated to admit it, but this was a close one. Until, the cannon suddenly fired. No one had touched it. No one had even been near the trigger. Yet somehow it exploded right then and there, sending a massive shockwave through the camp. Orcs, goblins, and squigs went flying in every direction. Gorgruk and Grimgutz, standing closest to the blast, were launched straight into the air, arms flailing as they screamed. They crashed into a pile of goblins, bounced off a stack of stolen dwarf shields, and landed face first in the mud. For a moment the entire camp was silent. Then, laughter erupted from every single orc present. The goblins who had barely survived immediately started cheering for whoever was still standing. Weirdchank dusted himself off and squinted at the wreckage. "Oh," he muttered, scratching his head. "The Red Skull's got more loot, but the Iron Stompes got the biggest thing. And now it's destroyed." He looked down at his ruined robes. "Also, me hut's on fire." He shrugged and turned to the record book, where Snicksnag, covered in soot and missing most of his hair, was trembling with his quill. "Write it down, shit," Weirdchank barked. "It's a tie." Snicksnag barely managed to scribble the words before passing out. Aftermath. Dawn next challenge. Gorgruk hauled himself out of the mud, furious. "A tie," he growled. "You mean I didn't even win? All dat loot, I still didn't win?" Grimgutz snorted, shaking off the dust. "Ha! At least me lads found the biggest shooty thing." "Dat got blown up," Gorgruk snapped. "Yeah," Grimgutz smirked. "And it was funny." The crowd of orcs cheered in agreement. Gorgruk was fuming. He had been humiliated again, and now the score was still in Grimgutz's favor. This couldn't stand. "Right. Dash it," he bellowed. "Da next challenge is da Great Squig Race." So the camp exploded into excitement. A race? With squigs? This was going to be properly stupid. Gorgruk stormed off, already planning his revenge. Grimgutz simply grinned and patted his bruised ribs. This bet was turning out to be the best idea he'd ever had. Chapter 5. Squig Racin Disaster. The day of Da Great Squig Race had arrived. Orcs from both the Red Skulls and the Iron Stompes gathered at the edge of Destompen Valley, a rough, rocky stretch of land infested with goblin traps, bottomless pits, and at least one mysterious hole that had been there since forever. The air was thick with excitement and the unmistakable smell of squigs, which was a mix of wet fungus, old meat, and violence. At the starting line, a dozen of the biggest, nastiest, and most uncooperative squigs were being dragged into place, snarling and snapping at their riders. Gorgruk Eadbasha and Grimgutz Irontoof stood on opposite sides, both astride their own specially picked racing squigs. Gorgruk's squig, Rippa, was a muscle-bound ball of teeth and rage, with a missing eye and a bad attitude. Grimgutz's squig, Chompaw, was even bigger, with jagged spikes growing out of its back and a scarred-up face that made it look permanently furious. Between them, the other riders were busy trying to stay on their squigs, some already getting thrown off, bitten, or trampled before the race even started. A few unlucky goblins had been eaten outright. Da rules, sort of. Weirdchank Dawazard stepped forward, raising his staff. "Right. Here's da rules," he bellowed. "First squig ta, reach da finish line. Wins." "No cheatin'?" The orcs booed. "Unless it's funny." The orcs cheered. Also, no stabbin' de squigs before the race starts. A few orcs grumbled and put their weapons away. Weirdchank raised his staff and fired a massive green lightning bolt into the sky. "On your marks." Da race begins. The Squigs immediately bolted forward, leaping wildly through the valley. Within seconds, half the riders were thrown off, bouncing across the ground like sacks of potatoes. One orc got kicked so hard by his Squig that he landed in a goblin minefield. Another tried to steer his Squig with reins, which it immediately ate. A particularly unlucky goblin, who had been standing too close, was swallowed whole by a passing Squig. Gorgruk and Grimgutz stayed neck and neck, their massive Squigs bounding over rocks, dodging pits, and smashing through goblin traps. Behind them, the rest of the race had devolved into pure anarchy. One orc had jumped onto another Squig and started punching its rider. Another was hanging onto his Squig's tail for dear life, screaming. A trio of goblins tried to cheat by riding a Squig together, but it turned and ate them before they even got halfway through the race. Then everything got worse. The biggest Squig goes rogue. Nobody noticed the biggest Squig in the valley. Until it was too late. This was Masher, a monstrous hulking beast of a Squig, covered in scar tissue and old wounds, with jaws big enough to chomp a troll in half. For years, Nasher had ruled this valley, eating anything that got too close. And today, he was in a bad mood. The vibrations from the race had woken him up, and he did not like being woken up. With a thunderous roar, Nasher charged straight into the race, crashing through the riders like a runaway doom wheel. Orcs screamed as they were sent flying. Squigs panicked and scattered in all directions. And at the front, Gorgruk and Grimgutz turned just in time to see the massive, slobbering beast barreling straight for them. "Oi," Grimgutz muttered. "That's a big Squig." "Run." "Ya jit," Gorgruk bellowed. But there was nowhere to run. Total Squig-base carnage. Nasher smashed through everything. A dozen racing Squigs fled in terror, crashing into each other. A goblin trap exploded, sending several unlucky riders sky-high. One Squig tried to fight Nasher and got bitten clean in half. Seeing no other option, Gorgruk and Grimgutz turned their Squigs around and charged at the beast. "If it ain't runnin', we kind it," Gorgruk roared. Told in agreement. Grimgutz howled in agreement. The two warbosses lunged, weapons raised, ready to smash the giant Squig's skull in. And that's when Masher jumped. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. Gnasher, in all his massive, toothy glory, soared through the air, mouth open wide. Before, crashing straight into both warbosses, chomping down and sending them flying in opposite directions. The end of the race. When the dust settled, the racecourse was destroyed. Squigs ran wild. Orcs limped out of craters. And at the finish line, no one had actually crossed it. Nasher was gone, having eaten enough things to be satisfied. And Gorgruk and Grimgutz were sprawled on the ground, covered in bite marks, bruises, and humiliation. Weirdshank walked over, took one look at the wreckage, and shook his head. Yeah. No one finished. Snicksnag, who had been hiding behind a rock the entire time, poked his head out. "So, does that mean—" Weirdshank sighed. "Yeah, another tie. Aftermath. Gorgruk is not happy." Gorgruk dragged himself up, spitting out a mouthful of dirt. "That don't count," he snarled. "We can't tie again. I ain't bosses to no stinkin' tie." Grimgutz groaned, pulling a Squig tooth out of his shoulder. Oh, looks like you ain't winning either." The orcs in the crowd burst into laughter. The race was a complete disaster, but that didn't matter. It had been glorious, stupid, and incredibly entertaining. But for Gorgruk, this was personal. He couldn't afford another draw, which meant it was time to pick a challenge he couldn't possibly lose. He stomped forward, glaring at Grimgutz. "Fine. Next challenge is gonna be something real horsey." Grimgutz raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? What?" Gorgruk grinned, cracking his knuckles. Trotassen. The camp exploded with excitement. Orcs cheered, goblins ran for their lives. And somewhere, a group of very unfortunate trolls had just become part of the dumbest competition yet. Chapter 6. Da Troll Tossing Tragedy. By now, the big bet had proven to be the most ridiculous and destructive series of contests the Badlands had ever seen. The Squig race had been a complete disaster, and Gorgruk was furious about another tie. So, to make sure there was no way he could lose, he picked something that relied on pure, brute Orci strength. Something real proper. Troll Tossen. A true test of strength. Right, Waaagh, Gorgruk bellowed at Grimgutz, pounding his chest. This time we do in a contest that only a proper boss can win. Grimgutz smirked, rolling his shoulders. What? A shouting match again? Gorgruk snarled. Trotassen. The orcs exploded into cheers, excited at the prospect of seeing large things get thrown into the air for no good reason. A few trolls, chained together at the edge of the camp, looked around in confusion, scratching their slimy heads. One ate a goblin standing too close. Gorgruk turned to the crowd. "Da rules is simple. We each grab a troll and see who can throw it da farthest." Grimgutz snorted. That's it. That's it. Gorgruk grinned. No cheatin', no sneaky tricks, just grab, spin, and toss. Grimgutz grinned wider. "Oh yeah," he said. "I love this idea." Round 1. Gorgruk's throw. The first troll, a massive, drooling brute named Snotbelch, was dragged forward, still looking confused. Gorgruk rolled his shoulders, planting his massive boots into the dirt. "Watch this," he growled. The orcs cheered as he grabbed the troll's arm, lifted it off the ground, spun in a massive circle, and whoosh. With a roar of effort, Gorgruk flung Snotbelch into the sky, sending the troll hurtling through the air. The orcs watched in amazement as the massive brute flew over the hills, arms flailing, before crashing down with an earth-shaking boom in the distance. A few seconds later, a pillar of dust rose into the sky. Gorgruk grinned, crossing his arms. "Talk dat, you tin-faced bootlicker." Grimgutz stroked his chin. "Erdele." "I will," he said. "In fact, I think I just got an even better idea." Round 2. Grimgutz's genius idea. Instead of picking up a troll himself, Grimgutz turned to his biggest lats. "Really?" he said. "Where's the catapult?" The orcs blinked. "Da what?" "Da catapult," Grimgutz repeated. "Da big shooty flingy thing we looted from da stunties." A group of goblins scurried forward, dragging a massive, rickety wooden war machine into the clearing. Gorgruk's eyes narrowed. "Oi," he growled. "This sounds like cheatin'." Grimgutz shrugged. "Nah, you said whoever gets the troll the farthest." "Yeah, by throwing it." Gorgruk roared. Grimgutz grinned wider. "I am throwing his—" Before Gorgruk could argue, Grimgutz's boys grabbed the nearest troll, strapped it into the catapult, and pulled the lever. The biggest troll launch in history. With a mighty twang, the catapult fired, launching the unlucky troll straight into the stratosphere. The orcs watched in stunned silence as the massive brute soared higher and higher, disappearing into the clouds. Somewhere in the distance, a flock of birds scattered in terror. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Grimgutz turned to Gorgruk and smirked. "You feel I think I won?" Gorgruk was speechless. Then Weirdshank squinted at the horizon. "Ah," the shaman muttered. "Where did it land?" A few seconds later, a loud explosion echoed from beyond the hills. Then, screaming. Then, horns blaring. Then, the unmistakable sound of Empire artillery firing back. Oops. A terrified goblin scout came sprinting into the camp, waving his arms. Bosses, he shrieked. "De troll just landed in an Empire town." The orcs blinked. Grimgutz laughed. "That's the farthest toss ever." The goblin kept screaming. "The HSAs think it was an attack. They're sending an army." Da Empire's response. Sure enough, from the distant hills a massive dust cloud was rising. At the head of it, banners bearing the Griffin of the Empire could be seen, marching straight for the orc camp. The orcs stared. Gorgruk facepalmed. Grimgutz grinned. He muttered. "Guess that means we gotta fight." Then the camp erupted into cheers. "A tie? Again? Nah." This was now a battle. Snicksnag, trembling in fear, scratched down the final score in his record book. Gorgruk's throw landed in Da Valley. Grimgutz's throw destroyed an Empire town. Result, Empire now attacking us. Final ruling, another bloody tie. Weirdshank closed the book, sighing deeply. "Hold him," Welpy muttered. "I hope you gets her ready for a fight." Gorgruk stomped forward, cracking his knuckles. "Fine," he growled. "Since that last round was a mess, I'm choosing the next event. Who kills the most humans?" The orcs roared with excellence. The goblins screamed and ran for cover. And somewhere, an unfortunate Empire commander was about to have the worst day of his life. Chapter 7. Building the Biggest Idol. After the Empire army had been thoroughly crumped, and any remaining humies had fled in terror, the Red Skulls and the Iron Stompaz returned to their big bet, because while fightin' was fun, being the best warboss was even funner. After a long night of celebrating, drinking, and headbutting each other unconscious, Gorgruk Eadbasha announced the next challenge. "Oi, listen up, you stinkbags," he bellowed, standing atop a pile of smashed Empire helmets. "We already proved we can crump stuff, but now we gotta prove who's the best at making stuff." The orcs looked at each other, confused. "What? Yeah? One more?" Jan Ogruk shouted. "We each gotta make the biggest and best idol of Gork-or-Mork." The orcs cheered, because while construction wasn't exactly their thing, building a big old statue for the Waaagh gods sounded like a proper Orci challenge. Grimgutz Irontoof grinned. "This'll be easy. Me lads got the best loot from the stunties. We'll make the biggest idol out of stolen dwarf statues." Gorgruk snorted. "More statues? Humph. They ain't Orci enough. Me lads are gonna make an idol out of pure bone." The crowd roared in approval. The challenge was set, and the disaster was about to begin. Da Great Idol build off. The next day, both tribes got to work, hacking, smashing, and looting everything they could to build the biggest, bestest idol. Gorgruk's lads raided old battlefield sites, dragging back piles of bones from fallen orcs, trolls, squigs, and humies. The Red Skulls were stacking ribs like bricks, building a monstrous bone effigy of Gork, or Mork. Grimgutz's lads took a different approach. They grabbed all the dwarf statues they'd stolen, plus a few extra from nearby Karakduras, glued them together with squig spit, and stacked them into a massive, ridiculous tribute to Mork, or Gork. From a distance, both idols looked impressively huge. From up close, they looked like a disaster waiting to happen. Gorgruk's bone idol was wobbly and unstable, with skulls precariously balancing on broken rib cages. Grimgutz's dwarf statue idol was lopsided and weird, since the dwarves hadn't exactly built their statues to be used as bricks. And the goblins, forced to do most of the actual construction, were not getting paid enough for this. At one point, Snicksnag, the scribe, still covered in soot from the troll launching incident, looked up at the idols and gulped. "Boss, I think the statues are leaning funny." Grimgutz kicked him into a pile of bricks. Shut up, Snicksnag. Da Grand Unveilen, an immediate collapse. Finally, after an entire day of work, the idols were ready to be unveiled. The orcs gathered around as the warbosses stepped forward to present their magnificent creations. Gorgruk was first. "Behold," he bellowed, waving dramatically at his towering spiky bone monstrosity. "Da mighty idol of Gork, or Mork, made from da bones of our enemies, da biggest, meanest idol ever built." The orcs cheered. Grimgutz snorted. "That's bull, huh?" He turned, pointing at his hulking dwarf statue idol. "Behold, a tribute to Mork, or Gork, made from the finest stunty stone, unbreakable." The orcs cheered again. For a moment it looked like both idols might actually stay standing. And then the bone idol shifted. A rib snapped. A skull rolled loose. And suddenly the entire thing wobbled dangerously. At the same time, the dwarf statue idol creaked. One of the statues at the bottom crumbled to dust under the weight. A single helmeted dwarf head popped off and hit the ground. Then everything happened at once. Total idol-based catastrophe. The bone idol collapsed first, sending a tidal wave of ribs and skulls crashing down into the red skulls. Orcs screamed as they were buried under a mountain of bones. Seconds later, trash. The dwarf statue idol followed, falling right into the middle of the iron stompas, shattering into chunks of bearded rubble. The orcs were instantly crushed under thousands of pounds of ancient stunty stone. Wyverns the shaman barely dodged a falling slab and turned to Snicksnag. "Write it down." "Yet. Both idols fell." Snicksnag, half buried under a pile of skulls, whimpered and scratched the result into his book. Another tie. Da aftermath. A lot of angry and sore orcs. Eventually the orcs dug themselves out, groaning and covered in either bone dust or dwarf statue chunks. Gorgruk stomped up to Grimgutz, still shaking a femur out of his armor. "Right, dis is getting stupid." Grimgutz spat out a mouthful of stunty gravel. "Yeah? What's your next brilliant idea?" Gorgruk thought hard. He needed something that wouldn't end in a draw. Something that would really prove who was the best. Then he grinned. He turned back to his lads. "Oi, next challenge, Gobbio kicking contest." The orcs erupted into cheers. The goblins, realizing what was about to happen, immediately panicked. Snicksnag, still trapped under a skull, squeaked in terror. The next round was set. And this time, it was going to get personal. Chapter 8. The Gobbo Kickin' Contest. After 4 straight ties, the war camp was getting restless. Orcs lived for fightin', smashin', and winnin', and so far neither warboss had pulled ahead. Tensions were high. Gorgruk Eadbasha was furious. Grimgutz Irontoof was amused. And the goblins, well, they were terrified. Da Great Gobbo Kicking Contest. "Right?" Gorgruk bellowed, standing atop a pile of broken dwarf statues. "Since our last game went badly," he shook some bone dust out of his armor, "we need a proper orcsy contest. And this time there's no way I'm tyin' with this boot-faced git again." Grimgutz smirked. "Oh yeah? What's your brilliant idea this time?" Gorgruk grinned, cracking his massive green knuckles. "Gobbio kickin' cottoness." The orcs erupted into cheers. The goblins, who had been standing nearby, immediately panicked. "What, whoa?" squealed Snicksnag the scribe, his beady red eyes wide with terror. "Using the goblet." Goblet continued, ignoring the goblin screams. Whoever can kick a goblet the farthest wins. A massive cheer tore through the camp as orcs everywhere stomped their feet and clapped their choppas together. This was exactly the kind of brainless competition they lived for. The goblins, however, screamed and tried to flee. A handful got caught immediately. Others were tackled by laughing orcs. And some, like Schnicksnag, desperately tried to hide under crates and behind barrels. Grimgutz, laughing, stepped forward. "This is a great idea. We've been putting up with gobbo nonsense for too long." Gorgruk grinned. "Then let's get kicking." Ida first kick, Gorgruk's turn. A particularly scrawny goblin, Snagga, was dragged forward, kicking and screaming. No, but Gorgruk cracked his neck, planted his massive iron boot into the dirt, and swung his leg back. With a thunderous wham, he booted Snagga straight into the air. The goblin shrieked, flailed, and disappeared over the camp walls, eventually landing somewhere in the squig pens. A few seconds later, a distant goblin scream could be heard. Jahong. The orcs cheered and laughed, clapping each other on the back. Weirdschank the wizard nodded. "That's a good kick." Snicksnag, shaking violently, scribbled into his record book. Gorgruk's kick, far enough to land into Squig pen. Goblin status, uncertain but probably eaten. Gorgruk cracked his knuckles and smirked. "Be dad, you boot-faced nobe." The second kick, Grimgutz's turn. Grimgutz stepped forward, grabbing a particularly unlucky goblin, Stika, by the scruff of his neck. Sticker flailed and screamed. "Unga kid's right, I ain't meat to flat." Grimgutz's kick was even harder. Stika soared through the air, tumbling end over end, and landed straight into an orc's cooking pot. For a moment there was silence. Then the orc cook, gull-grubbed soup boss, blinked down at his bubbling cauldron. "Ah," Gulgrub muttered. "I think I just invented gobble stew." The orcs erupted into laughter. Weirdschank shrugged and wrote it down. Grimgutz's kick landed in a cookpot. Goblin status, cookin'. Grimgutz crossed his arms, grinning. "Looks like I got the most useful kick." "That ain't the point," Gorgruk snapped. "It's about distance." Before they could start arguing, a terrified goblin voice shrieked. "And not? We ain't taking it no more." The orcs blinked in surprise. The goblins, normally too cowardly to fight back, had finally snapped. And in a shocking turn of events, they revolted. The Gobble Rebellion. From every corner of the camp, goblins erupted from their hiding places. Some lobbed rocks at the orcs. Others threw squigs into the crowd, hoping for chaos. One particularly insane goblin set Weirdchank's hut on fire again. Snicksnag, normally too cowardly to join in, realized this was his chance. With a squeak, he grabbed his record book, climbed onto a rock, and screamed, "Dol, wife da boots. Ho 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 ha ha. Down, wife da kicks." A wave of goblins rushed forward, shrieking. The orcs, caught completely off guard, stumbled backward. Grimgutz, blinking, looked around. "Ha, this is new," Gorgruk roared in frustration. "We, stupid gits, get back in your place." He grabbed the nearest goblin and chucked it into a tent. Grimgutz punched another goblin across the camp, but it was too late. A night of anarchy. For the next several hours, the orc camp descended into complete goblin-fueled madness. A group of goblins tried to steal the squig cages. It ended badly. A squig rider got thrown off and landed in a pile of explosives. At least 3 goblins attempted to flee into the hills, only to run into an ogre that immediately ate them. Snicksnag led a revolutionary council for approximately 5 minutes before being trampled by his own goblins. By midnight, the goblin uprising was officially crushed, mostly because they ran out of energy and got bored. Day aftermath, another stupid tie. By dawn, most of the goblins were either missing, unconscious, or too scared to fight. Gorgruk stood in the wreckage, panting. Right. I think we stopped that nonsense. Grimgutz, covered in soot, nodded. But... He gestured around. Who won the gobble kicking contest? The orcs looked at Weirdshank. The shaman, bleary-eyed and exhausted, sighed heavily. No one. It's a tie. Gorgruk is furious. Gorgutz's eye twitched. Ollie! Tai? Bosha? Grimgutz grinned. Looks like you just can't beat me, eh? Doubt it, Gorgruk bellowed. We need a new contest. He thought for a second, then grinned. Go with me. Whoever kills the most humans wins. The orcs cheered. The goblins, who were too weak to protest, just whimpered. And somewhere, a very unlucky Empire patrol was about to have a very, very bad day. Chapter 9. Oops, we broke the humies. After yet another tie, tensions in the orc camp were higher than ever. Eadbasha was furious. Grimgutz Irontoof was still smug. And the orcs? They just wanted more fighting. That's when Gorgruk got his brilliant idea. Right. This time we's gonna have a real contest. No more kicking, no more building, just straight up crumpin'. Grimgutz cracked his knuckles. Finally a game that makes sense. The contest? Who can kill day, most humbly. The orcs roared with excitement. The goblins screamed in terror. And somewhere, an unfortunate Empire town was about to have the worst day in its history. The stomp of death. The next morning, both tribes marched out into the human lands, ready for their biggest crumpfest yet. It wasn't long before they found a target. A small Empire town lay nestled in the valley ahead, a peaceful settlement filled with farmers, traders, and completely unsuspecting guards who had no idea what was coming. From their vantage point on a nearby hill, Gorgruk and Grimgutz looked down at the town. Gorgruk grinned, raising his chopper. Right, boys, the conic starts now. The orcs roared and charged. The humans? They had about 5 seconds before their day was completely ruined. Total mayhem. The red skulls and iron stompas tore through the town, smashing through buildings, flipping over carts, and sending screaming peasants running in all directions. Some highlights included one orc trying to count how many humies he'd killed, but losing track after 5. A goblin riding a stolen donkey before crashing into a wall. A particularly ambitious squig eating an entire bakery. A poor farmer who had woken up expecting a normal day, getting thrown out of his own house by a laughing orc. Gorgruk swung his club left and right, flattening anything in his path. Grimgutz kicked open doors, grabbed whatever looked valuable, and then set everything on fire anyway. As the town collapsed into total chaos, Snicksnag the scribe, somehow still alive, frantically tried to write down the orcs' kill scores. Boss, you're at 32, he squeaked, dodging an airborne chicken. Gorgruk grinned. What's good, Jinga, Todd? Snicksnag checked the tally. 32. Gorgruk froze. Then his eye twitched. Another time. Before he could explode in rage, a trumpet blared from the distance. The Empire had arrived. The Empire's retaliation. From the far side of the valley, a column of soldiers appeared, knights, spearmen, and a handful of cannons dragged by horses. At the front of the force, a young, inexperienced noble in fancy armor sat atop his warhorse. His name? Ludwig von Kessler, and he was about to have a very bad time. Kessler raised his sword, his voice cracking slightly. "Men of the Empire, these filthy greenskins have defiled our land. We shall drive them back with steel and—" Before he could finish, a random orc threw a chicken at him. It hit him in the face. For a moment, the entire battlefield went silent. Then Grimgutz and Gorgruk both turned to each other and grinned. "New contest," Gorgruk roared. "Who can kill Darvathan? Boys!" "Iha, Iromo," Grimgutz bellowed. The Empire troops looked at each other nervously. This was not what they had expected. The battle begins. The orc warbands immediately charged at the Empire forces. Instead of a coordinated attack, however, it became a competition. Gorgruk smashed his way through a line of spearmen, grabbing one by the legs and using him as a club against his own comrades. Grimgutz tackled a knight off his horse, stole the helmet, then threw it at another knight so hard it knocked him unconscious. A cannon misfired and blew up half of the human front lines, to which both warbosses argued over who got credit for the kills. An unlucky goblin, trying to be sneaky, accidentally tripped an Empire gunner, causing him to shoot his own officer. Ludwig von Kessler tried to rally his men, only to get tackled by an orc and dragged screaming into a pile of mud. By mid-afternoon, the battlefield was a mess. The Empire forces, completely overwhelmed, started to retreat. Somewhere in the chaos, Snicksnag, the only one still trying to keep score, frantically scribbled notes while dodging flying debris. "Boss, you're at 64. Gorgruk pounded his chest. "HA, beat down Grimgutz." Grimgutz grinned, stomping over a pile of fallen knights. 65. Gorgruk's eyes whitened. "To what? No way. I had more." "Too bad," Grimgutz smirked. "I just crumped one more than you." "That don't count. You to sit." Before the argument could escalate into another fistfight, the last of the Empire troops fled over the hills, leaving their fallen behind. The battle was won. The town was in ruins. And yet, it was another bloody tie. Aftermath. Furious Gorgruk. Gorgruk stomped forward, fuming. "Ye is get out of my control," he roared. "We've done 8 contest H&I. I still ain't won. I need a real challenge, something I can't lose." Grimgutz folded his arms. "Hey, what you got in mind?" Gorgruk thought hard. Then he grinned. "Whoever, Tamen." The orcs gasped. Grimgutz raised an eyebrow. "You serious?" "Dead serious," Gorgruk growled. "Whoever can catch and ride a wyvern first is the best boss." The crowd erupted in excitement. The goblins fainted. And somewhere in the mountains, a very large and very angry wyvern was about to have a very bad day. Chapter 10. The Great Wyvern Wrestle. After 8 straight contests ending in either a tie or complete disaster, Gorgruk had enough. He needed a challenge that would truly prove who was the biggest, bestest warboss. And what was more Orcy than riding a massive, flying, scaly, angry death lizard? "Wyvern Tamen," Gorgruk had declared, pounding his chest. Grimgutz grinned. "Heh, now this is a good idea." The orcs roared with excitement. The goblins whimpered. And somewhere in the nearby mountains, an unfortunate wyvern was about to have the worst day of its life. The hunt for the biggest beast. By midday, both tribes had gathered their biggest lads and marched toward the Wyvern Cliffs, a craggy mountain range known for being infested with the nastiest flying beasts around. Gorgruk and Grimgutz stood at the base of the cliffs, looking up at the jagged peaks. First one to catch and ride a wyvern wins, Gorgruk growled. Grimgutz smirked. Easy, just gotta find one. One of the orcs squinted up at the cliffs. "Oh, boss," he muttered. "I think one already found us. Meet Skullcracker, the biggest, meanest wyvern in the Badlands." Before anyone could react, a deafening screech echoed from the cliffs above. A massive shadow passed overhead, and then Skullcracker dropped down right in front of them. Skullcracker was the biggest wyvern anyone had ever seen. His wings were tattered from 100 battles. His scales were scarred, and his left eye was missing. His breath smelled like 1,000 years of rotting meat. And he was very, very angry. For a long moment, the orcs stared in awe. Then Grimgutz grinned. "Heh, that's the one." Gorgruk cracked his knuckles. "Let's crump 'em. The wrestling begins." The first wave of orcs charged in, eager to prove themselves. Skullcracker immediately grabbed one in his jaws and swallowed him whole. The orcs paused. "Right," said one. "That ain't good." Gorgruk, ignoring the obvious danger, stomped forward. "Grab 'em," he bellowed. The orcs rushed forward, swarming the wyvern. Some highlights of the battle included one orc trying to reason with Skullcracker, only to get tail-whipped off the mountain. A goblin climbing onto the wyvern's back, immediately being flung into the sky, and never being seen again. Weirdchank de Wazard attempting a magic spell to calm the beast, which only made its breath smell worse. Snicksnag hiding behind a rock, scribbling notes about how this was a very bad idea. Despite losing a lot of orcs, Gorgruk and Grimgutz finally managed to pin Skullcracker down. Gorgruk grabbed its neck. Grimgutz held onto its tail. And Amy Jack. The wyvern thrashed violently, sending orcs flying. "I got it," Gorgruk roared. "I win!" "No, you don't," Grimgutz snarled, trying to mount its back. "I'm redding him first." "Oh, yeah, Chit, this one's mine." Before either boss could claim victory, Skullcracker did what wyverns do best. The escape. With a mighty screech, Skullcracker flapped his massive wings, kicking up a storm of dust. Both warbosses, still hanging onto the beast, were lifted straight into the air. What? Aha! For one glorious moment, it looked like they had done it. They were actually riding the wyvern. Then Skullcracker rolled midair, and both warbosses were immediately flung off. They screamed as they plummeted, crashed through a row of trees, bounced off a cliffside, and landed face-first in a swamp. The orcs, watching from below, winced. "Oh!" Skullcracker let out a victorious screech, then flew off into the distance, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. And just like that, the wyvern was gone. Aftermath. By the time Gorgruk and Grimgutz crawled out of the swamp, the orcs had already gathered around, waiting for the results. Weirdchank, still covered in dirt, sighed. "Who won?" Snicksnag flipped through his notes, trying to find an answer. 1,000 pesos later, he muttered, "Neither of them actually wrote it." The orcs nodded. That seemed accurate. Weirdchank shrugged. "It's another tie. Gorgruk is absolutely done." Gorgruk, still spitting out swamp water, stomped forward. "Ooh, that's a tie." Grimgutz laughed, shaking mud off his armor. "Hey, looks like you still can't beat me." Gorgruk was now vibrating with pure, unfiltered rage. He grabbed the nearest goblin and threw it into a tree. "Right, no more stupid challenges." Grimgutz crossed his arms. "Oh, so you given up?" "Oh," Gorgruk growled. "We settled this old way." Grimgutz grinned. A proper boss fight. The orcs cheered. The goblins scattered. And somewhere Skullcracka laughed to himself, having successfully ruined their day. Chapter 11. Tunneling into the wrong place. After 10 straight contests, with nothing but ties, disaster, or extreme property damage, the orc camp was getting restless. The goblins were traumatized. The orcs were impatient. And Gorgruk Eadbasha was absolutely done with this nonsense. So, when Grimgutz Irontoof suggested yet another ridiculous challenge, Gorgruk didn't even argue. He just growled and went along with it. The tunneling contest. "We dig a tunnel," Grimgutz said, arms crossed. "First one to break through to the other side wins." Gorgruk snorted. "That's the dumbest thing I ever heard." Grinbit grinned. "Then why you agree into it?" "Pace, shut up." With that, both warbosses grabbed their best diggers, gathered their biggest shovels, and goblin slaves, and began their race underground. Da diggin' begins. Orcs were not known for their engineering skills. Within minutes the tunnels were uneven, full of collapsed dirt, and had more goblins buried alive than was probably necessary. Gorgruk's Red Skulls focused on raw strength, smashing through rock and dirt like they were swinging choppas. Grimgutz's Iron Stompas actually thought ahead and used explosives, which helped at first, until one particularly enthusiastic goblin detonated himself. After hours of digging, both tunnels suddenly broke through into a massive underground cavern. And that's when things went wrong. Welcome to Skavenville. Both warbosses pushed through the last bit of rock and stumbled into a massive underground city, complete with rickety wooden bridges, glowing warpstone lamps, and an army of twitching, armored ratmen who immediately started squealing in panic. The orcs and goblins stared. The Skaven stared back. Then one of the Skaven, a warlock engineer, chittered. What is this, greenskins? Kill them! Now! Suddenly, a swarm of Skaven assassins, storm vermin, and mutant rat things burst from the shadows, weapons raised. But instead of panicking like normal invaders, the orcs just looked confused. Gorgruk squinted. "Oi, why do Desagabos got tails?" Grimgutz nodded. "And why they talk so much?" One of the goblins, still covered in dirt, looked up at them. "Bosses, I think these ain't gabos." Gorgruk immediately punched him across the cavern. "Up, of course, they is, look at 'em, small, snaky, smell bad." "Phew," Grimgutz agreed. "They're just extra ugly gabos." The Skaven, completely insulted, collectively screeched in rage. "Fools, we are the mighty, mighty Skaven, the great, great under-empire, not goblins." The orcs paused. Then they burst out laughing. "Under-empire? That's the stupidest thing I ever heard." One of the Skaven hissed in frustration. "These loud, dumb things, destroy them. Da battle begins." The Skaven army surged forward, warpstone weapons crackling, poisoned daggers flashing in the dark. The orcs? They roared with laughter and charged in head first. Some highlights of the most one-sided battle in Skaven history included a Skaven warlock engineer trying to fire his warp lightning cannon only to have an orc use it as a club. A pack of Skaven assassins attempting a sneak attack, only to be immediately stepped on. Weirdshank de Wazard misfiring a spell and turning a dozen Skaven into explosive mushrooms. A goblin accidentally drinking warpstone juice and glowing for the rest of the battle. One Skaven tried to reason with the orcs. Wait, we can make a deal. We have shiny things. We have power, we can—" He was immediately thrown off a bridge. Within minutes, the Skaven were in full retreat. Their squeals echoed through the tunnels as they fled, some running directly into their own traps, others getting trampled by their panicked leaders. Gorgruk, covered in rat blood, stomped forward and looked around. Well, this was the easiest battle ever. Grimgutz nodded. Yeah, guess the weird gobos ain't that tough. One of the goblins trembled, clutching his skull. But they ain't goblos. Gorgruk immediately kicked him into a hole. Shut up. Da aftermath. Another bloody tie. As the last of the Skaven vanished into the darkness, Snicksnag, who had miraculously survived, pulled out his record book. So, who won? The orcs blinked. Then, both warbosses immediately turned to each other. I crumped more of 'em, Gorgruk growled. No, you didn't, Grimgutz snapped. I did. Weirdshank, rubbing his temples, sighed. Da score's even. It's a tie. Again. For a long moment, silence filled the cavern. What the? Gorgruk tackled Grimgutz. Grimgutz punched Gorgruk in the gut. And just like that, the warbosses started brawling again, rolling through the wreckage of the battle, punching, kicking, and biting each other, while the remaining orcs cheered them on. Snicksnag, covered in dirt and bruises, slumped against a wall and sighed. This bed is never going to end. Chapter 12. Dwarf Revenge. The orc camp was still buzzing with excitement after their unexpected, and incredibly one-sided, battle against the weird gobos, otherwise known as Skaven. Gorgruk Eadbasha was still fuming from yet another tie. Grimgutz Irontoof was still smug. And the orcs? They were getting used to every challenge ending in ridiculous destruction. Unfortunately, they had no idea what was coming next. The dwarfs ain't happy. Somewhere in the distance, the ground began to shake. A deep, thunderous drumming echoed through the valley. The orcs paused, listening. Then, from over the hills, a massive army of angry, heavily armored dwarfs appeared. It was the remnants of Karak-Duraw's defenders, the very same dwarfs that had previously been looted, humiliated, and had their statues turned into a very bad idol. And they were here for revenge. At their head, riding a war machine covered in runes, was Thane Durgan Ironhelm, his great white beard blowing in the wind. His face was bright red with fury. His army was marching in perfect formation, and his grudge book was wide open. There they are, laughed Durgan, roared, pointing toward the orc war camp. The green devils who stole our statues, drank our beer, and desecrated our whore. The dwarfs cheered angrily. We will have our vengeance. We will wipe them out. Liam Seton paces the war machine fired a cannon blast into the sky, signaling the charge. The orcs stared at the approaching army. Then Grimgutz turned to Gorgruk and smirked. Oi. What? Gorgruk snapped. Grimgutz cracked his knuckles. New contest. Who can crump the most beards? The warbosses turned to their armies. Hurry by, Gorgruk bellowed. New game. Whoever cumps most beards wins. The orcs erupted into cheers. The dwarfs erupted into confusion. Durgan squinted. as a expression. Did they just turn this into a bloody competition? A nearby dwarf looked equally confused. I think they did, boss. By Grungni's beard, these green lunatics are dumber than a sack of hammerless runts. The orcs, completely ignoring the dwarf's frustration, charged. The battle began. Total battlefield madness. What should have been a serious, disciplined battle quickly turned into the dumbest competition in orc history. Gorgruk swung his club, knocking a dwarf's helmet clean off. Grimgutz tackled a dwarf, grabbed his beard, and tried to rip it off like a trophy. One particularly confused orc tried to eat a beard, only to start choking on it. A goblin stole a dwarf's axe and immediately fell over because it was too heavy. An orc, mistaking a particularly short human for a dwarf, drop-kicked him across the battlefield. Meanwhile, Snicksnag the scribe, somehow still alive, was scribbling down beard count tallies. "Boss, you're at 15 beards," he called to Gorgruk. "Beat, yeah, yeah, jit," Gorgruk laughed, smashing another dwarf into the dirt. "Oi, Snicksnag," Grimgutz called. "I got 17. Gorgruk's eyes twitched. "Oh, I bloody do too. Prove it." Busting. "Look at DAPLOBs. I got." Gorgruk looked at the pile of dwarfs Grimgutz had knocked down. Sure enough, their beards were tangled together, making it look like one massive, hairy collection. Gorgruk growled, "This ain't over." The dwarfs finally get sick of this. After about an hour of senseless brawling, Thane Durgan had seen enough. Covered in dust and orc blood, his patience finally snapped. "Enough of this madness," he bellowed. The remaining dwarfs suddenly stopped fighting and began pulling back. Durgan glared at the warbosses. "You blasted greenskins. You don't even know why we're here, do you?" Gorgruk paused, blinking. "'Cause you wanted to lose?" The dwarfs groaned collectively. Durgan took a deep breath. "This is, without a doubt, the stupidest battle I have ever been part of." The orcs looked at each other, confused. "How does that mean we won?" Grimgutz asked. Durgan pointed a furious finger at them. "Mark my words, greenskins. This is not over. We shall return, and we shall have our—" Before he could finish, a random goblin hit him in the face with a rock. The dwarfs retreated in disgust, too angry to continue the fight. The orcs, however, were too busy arguing to care. Another stupid tie. Snicksnag, covered in dirt, checked his record book. Looks like you both crumped the same number of beards." Gorgruk froze. Grimgutz froze. Waaagh, already exhausted from the day's stupidity, sighed. It's enough." Gorgruk finally snaps. Gorgruk roared in frustration. "This is stupid. We're never gonna win this battle." Grimgutz cracked his neck. "Well, there's only one way to settle it, then." Gorgruk narrowed his eyes. "Oh yeah." Grimgutz grinned. "Boss fight." The orcs cheered. The goblins screamed. And somewhere, the gods of Waaagh themselves were watching eagerly. Chapter 13. Robbing the biggest loot. After 12 rounds of absolute nonsense, the orc camp was at its breaking point. There was still no winner. Gorgruk Eadbasha was furious. Grimgutz Irontoof was still smug. And the orcs were now so used to chaos that they were just waiting for the next disaster to happen. So when Gorgruk bellowed out the next contest, nobody was even surprised. Duh. Next challenge. Who can nick da best? Loot. Right, Gorgruk growled, stomping in front of the gathered orcs. Since all these contests keep ending in ties, we're doing something simple. The orcs nodded. The goblins trembled. "We steal stuff?" The orcs cheered. Grimgutz grinned. "I like this plan." Gorgruk turned to his warband. "Whoever can steal Bess' biggest loot from another warboss wins." More cheering. Weirdshank that Wizard rubbed his temples. "There's a stupid idea." Snicksnag, clutching his record book, whimpered. "Where he lootin' from, boss?" Gorgruk grinned. "Warboss Fragfang." The orcs immediately stopped cheering. A long, awkward silence followed. Finally, one orc cleared his throat. "Ya boss? Ya mean Scragfang the Black Orc?" "Yeah," Gorgruk grunted. "The same Scragfang Watts got the biggest, meanest warband in the Badlands?" "Yeah." "The same Scragfang Watts got an army of Black Orcs what hate normal orc?" "Yeah," Gorgruk snapped. "What of it?" The orcs gulped. Then Grimgutz, grinning ear to ear, stepped forward. "No one dares loot Scragfang's camp. If I pull it off, I'll finally be the best boss." Gorgruk snorted. "It's funny, 'cause I'm the one who's gonna pull it off. Wanna bet?" All he did, yak it. The orcs cheered. The goblins panicked. And somewhere Warboss Scragfang had no idea he was about to have the worst night of his life. Our heist begins. By nightfall, both Gorgruk and Grimgutz led their warbands towards Scragfang's fortress-like camp. It was a heavily guarded, Black Orc-controlled stronghold, the kind of place that normal orcs did not mess with. But these weren't normal orcs. These were absolute idiots. Gorgruk's sneaky plan, that wasn't sneaky at all. Gorgruk, not known for his brains, had come up with a sneaky plan. "All right, lads," he whispered, crouching behind a stack of old wagons. "We sneak in, grab the biggest loot, and leg it before the Black Orcs notice." One of his biggest boys scratched his head. "Boss, we ain't exactly sneaky." "Chatter. We sneaky, if we say we is." That was good enough for them. Unfortunately, Gorgruk's idea of sneaking was smashing through the front gate and screaming, "Yeah!" at the top of his lungs, which alerted every single Black Orc in the camp. Grimgutz's better plan. That was somehow even worse. Meanwhile, Grimgutz took a different approach. He had his lads dig a tunnel under Scragfang's loot tent to steal his biggest treasure. It was a smart plan, until they dug straight into Scragfang's armory. Instead of sneaking in, they came up under a pile of Black Orc weapons. A particularly confused Black Orc grabbed a sword just as Grimgutz's head popped out from the ground. A goblin tried to run but tripped over a pile of explosives. An orc knocked over a stack of shields, causing an avalanche of armor. In less than 10 seconds, the entire Black Orc war camp was awake and furious. Black Orc rebellion begins. Warboss Scragfang, a massive, scarred-up Black Orc, covered in the biggest armor anyone had ever seen, stomped out of his tent. His glowing red eyes surveyed the destruction. He took a deep breath, and then roared in pure, unfiltered rage. "What the Zog is going on in my camp?" At that moment, both Gorgruk and Grimgutz popped out from the wreckage, each holding a stolen treasure. They froze. The entire Black Orc army stared at them. Then Gorgruk grinned. "Oi, Grimgutz. What? This is another tie, innit?" Grimgutz sighed. "Yep." Then every Black Orc in the camp attacked. Da battle nobody wanted. What was supposed to be a sneaky loot raid turned into a full-blown Black Orc rebellion. Some highlights included: one orc trying to explain it was just a friendly bet, before getting kicked so hard he landed in a tree. A goblin tripping over a barrel of explosives and setting half the camp on fire. Weirdchanked a wizard, accidentally summoning a wild squig which immediately ate a tent. Scragfang headbutting an orc so hard it sent shockwaves through the ground. Meanwhile, Snicksnag, hiding under a pile of loot, scribbled frantically. "Bosses, you're both getting crumped." Gorgruk, fighting off 5 black orcs at once, roared back. "Don't chat. Who's winning?" Snicksnag checked the tally. It's even." Gorgur froze. Grimgutz, who was about to smash a black orc over the head, also froze. Then they both turned to each other. "Another tie?" "This is getting stupid. You escaping Lingstar, or Legged lads." Realizing this was not going well, the 2 warbosses did the only logical thing. They ran for their lives. Shoving aside goblins, grabbing whatever loot they could carry, and punching anything that got in their way, both warbands fled the camp, pursued by an army of screaming black orcs. By the time they made it back to their own camp, half their boys were missing, their loot was stolen back, and Scragfang had officially declared war on them. Weirdchankh sighed, rubbing his forehead. Well, that went about as well as expected." Snicksnag, covered in dirt and bruises, checked his book. So, who won?" Weirdchankh groaned. Very transcendentalism. "It's another bloody tie." Gorgruk loses his mind. Gorgruk was now beyond furious. "This is never gonna end." Grimgutz, still catching his breath, grinned. "Guess we gotta keep going." Gorgruk growled. "Owain, next event, Squig wrestling." The orcs cheered. The goblins panicked. And somewhere the squigs in their pens began to sense impending doom. Chapter 14. Running from the Gitstorm. By now, the orc war camp was in complete chaos. Empire soldiers, dwarfs with grudges, an army of very, very angry black orcs. And they were all coming straight for Gorgruk, Eadbasha, and Grimgutz Irontoof. How it all went wrong. Again. First, the Empire army had shown up. Apparently they were still mad about the last battle, where the orcs flattened their town, kicked their commander into the mud, and turned their mayor into a football. So now they had gathered an even bigger army to wipe the orcs out? Then the dwarfs returned. Thane Durgan Ironhelm was back, and this time he had siege weapons. And lastly, Warboss Scragfang's black orcs were still marching toward them, bellowing threats about skinning them alive for stealing from their camp. Basically, it was the worst Waaagh hangover ever. A new competition, who can leg it the best. Gorgruk and Grimgutz stood on a rocky hill overlooking the approaching armies. The orcs around them shifted nervously. The goblins were already trying to sneak away. Grimgutz stroked his chin. "This don't look too good." Gorgruk gritted his teeth. "Ain't a problem. We just... He glanced at the warband. Orcs were many things. Brutal, loud, crumpy. But they weren't exactly built for strategy. Grimgutz grinned. "Guess we gotta run." Gorgruk immediately turned and snarled. "What? A walk stole run." Grimgutz smirked. "Well, we don't gotta call it running." The 2 bosses locked eyes. And, just like every other bad idea, they turned it into a contest. "The rowdy boys! New challenging!" Gorgruk bellowed. "Who can run daft fastest while looking like they ain't running?" The orcs erupted into cheers. The goblins, realizing this wasn't an actual escape plan, started screaming. And the 3 massive armies in the distance continued marching, straight for them. Da great not quite runnin' race. As the enemies closed in, both warbands took off at full speed, but not in a straight-up panic. Oh no. They had to make it look cool. This resulted in one of the dumbest races ever seen in the history of the old world. Some highlights included orcs running with their chests puffed out, pretending to be on a casual stroll. One orc carrying a log to look important, only to trip over a goblin and roll down a hill. A group of orcs power walking while loudly saying things like, "We ain't running, we just going fast." A goblin trying to run too fast, tripping and immediately being trampled by his own side. Weird Shank de Wazar hovering slightly off the ground, pretending to float instead of run. One orc hopping on a stolen Empire horse, but refusing to gallop. Instead, he made it walk quickly, pretending it was normal. Snicksnag, somehow keeping pace despite his tiny goblin legs, frantically scribbled notes. Boss, you're at maximum speed, Wipeout, looking like you're running. Gorgruk grinned. H-A-H, that means I win. Grimgutz, jogging beside him, smirked. You don't. I been running cooler than you. The two bosses started shoving each other while running, neither willing to admit they were actually just legging it for their lives. Meanwhile, back at the camp, the Empire soldiers arrived first. Seeing no orcs left, the commander frowned. Where are they? Then the dwarfs arrived. Thane Durgan squinted at the abandoned camp. Wait, are they gone? And then the Black Orcs stormed in, smashing through the remains of the orc fortress. Scragfang looked around, confused. Did the Zog and Gitz just leave? The three armies stared at each other. Then they all turned on each other. Within minutes, the Empire, the Dwarves, and the Black Orcs were brawling over who had the right to crump the now empty orc camp. It was absolute madness, and the orcs missed all of it. The finish line, sorta. After hours of running, but not running, Gorgruk and Grimgutz finally came to a stop on top of a large hill. Looking back, they saw smoke rising from their old camp. Gorgruk, panting, frowned. Oi, they're fighting each other. Grimgutz grinned. Ha, guess we got out of Derrit Da right time. The orcs all slumped over, exhausted. Weirdchank wiped his brow. Well, that was something. Snicksnag, completely covered in sweat, checked his record book. So, who won? The orcs paused. Then, both Gorgruk and Grimgutz turned toward each other. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, I don't know what? Gorgruk bellowed. I don't care. I'm pickin' da. Next event, and it's the last one. The orcs cheered. The goblins groaned. Grimgutz, still grinning, crossed his arms. Oh yeah, what's the final event? Gorgruk stepped forward, cracked his knuckles and snarled. Final boss fight. The crowd exploded. This was it. No more ties, no more running. Just one last brutal, stupid fight to finally settle who was the best. Chapter 15. Fightin' over de last chopper. After hours of runabout running, the orc warband finally stopped at the edge of a dead forest. Their camp was gone. Their supplies were low. And worst of all, they only had one chopper left. Da last chopper in Da Badlands. It was a legendary weapon, said to have been forged by the biggest, meanest orc in history, or at least the biggest, meanest orc from about 5 years ago. A massive, jagged blade still covered in dried blood and Squig teeth marks. And it was the only real weapon left after their warband had spent too long legging it from the Humies, the Stunties, and the angry Black Orcs. The orcs gathered around it, eyes gleaming. Grimgutz folded his arms. Well. Looks like there's only one good chopper left. Gorgruk gritted his teeth. Yeah, and it's gonna be mine." The two warbosses locked eyes. The orcs held their breath. Then, at the exact same time, fight form. The war camp erupted into cheers. The goblins tried to sneak away, knowing exactly where this was going. Weirdshank sighed and sat down on a rock. "Welp, here we go again." Ultimate duel begins. Gorgruk cracked his knuckles. Grimgutz stretched his arms. Then they charged. Gorgruk swung first, trying to punch Grimgutz's jaw clean off. Grimgutz ducked, tackled Gorgruk to the ground, and started headbutting him repeatedly. Gorgruk grabbed a nearby Squig and threw it at Grimgutz. Grimgutz grabbed a goblin and threw it back. Both warbosses wrestled in the dirt, biting, kicking, and throwing rocks at each other like two massive, enraged toddlers. The orcs cheered louder and louder. Then, just as Gorgruk had Grimgutz in a headlock, a distant, blood-curdling screech echoed through the trees. Then another. Then a lot more. Weirdshank's eyes widened. "Uisok." Snicksnag, clutching his record book, trembled. Bosses. Neither warboss stopped fighting. Then the ground began to shake. Then the trees began to shake. Then, bursting from the darkness, came the night goblin stampede. Hundreds, no, thousands of crazed, screaming night goblins charged out of the trees, their beady red eyes glowing in the dark. They were armed with rusty daggers, bent spears, and way too many explosive mushrooms. And worst of all, they were riding squigs. A lot of squigs. The orcs froze. The goblins screamed. Snicksnag immediately dropped his record book and ran. Weirdshank groaned. "Oh, this again." The fight gets interrupted by madness. Gorgruk and Grimgutz, still mid-wrestle, barely had time to react before the first wave of Squig riders smashed straight into them. They were both launched into the air, crashing down into a pile of goblins. And just like that, the entire orc war camp descended into chaos. Some highlights included a goblin screaming, "Waaagh!" before immediately getting trampled by his own Squig. One orc getting chased by 3 night goblins, only for him to turn around and crump all of them at once. Weirdshank trying to cast a spell to calm the situation, accidentally summoning more Squigs instead. A goblin setting off a mushroom bomb too early, launching himself straight into a tree. A particularly massive Squig swallowing a tent, along with 2 very unfortunate goblins inside it. Gorgruk, climbing out of a pile of screaming goblins, roared. "All right, that's it. Everyone start crumping." The orcs roared in agreement. The goblins screamed in terror. And the greatest, dumbest free-for-all battle in orc history began. The aftermath. Where's the choppa? By the time the dust settled, the goblins were either running away, unconscious, or buried under piles of squig dung. The orcs were exhausted, covered in bruises, and missing at least 1 boot each. And the legendary choppa? It was gone. Weirdshank, covered in dirt, groaned. "Well, that's just great." Snicksnag, nursing a black eye, frantically flipped through his notes. "Bosses. So, who won?" The orcs paused. Then Gorgruk and Grimgutz, both still furious, turned to each other. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then, "You know what?" Gorgruk bellowed. "I don't even care about the choppa no more." Grimgutz wiped blood from his mouth. "Yeah? Then what's next you get?" Gorgruk snarled. The challenge boss fight. No more ties. No more stupid games. The last, or standing, is best warlord. The orcs erupted in cheers. The goblins tried to run, and somewhere in the distance, a single night goblin, still trapped in a tree, whimpered. Chapter 16. The biggest fireball competition. After 15 straight contests, a warpath of destruction across the Badlands, and more tied scores than any self-respecting orc should allow, the situation in the war camp had reached a breaking point. No more games, no more running, no more gobble kicking. Gorgruk Eadbasha was done. Grimgutz Irontoof was still smug. And the orcs? They were just here for the fireworks. Today's shamans step in. Before the warbosses could launch into their final, definitive fistfight, a gravelly voice interrupted. "Oi, hold up, you stupid gits." The crowd turned as one. Standing in the middle of the war camp, covered in war paint, burn marks, and bits of exploded goblin, were the two most unstable orcish spellcasters in the Badlands. Weirdchank de Wazard, shaman of the Red Skulls, who had a nasty habit of accidentally summoning angry squigs whenever he cast spells. Mad Zogwart, the Iron Stompa's resident loon, famous for turning his own lads into mushrooms whenever he sneezed too hard. Weirdchank stepped forward, slamming his staff into the dirt. "I been watching dis whole stupid bet," he growled. "And you know what? Dis ain't a proper contest." Mad Zogwart nodded, drool dripping from his tusks. "What you need," he said, his eyes glowing green with Waaagh energy, "is the biggest, nastiest, most explodious fireball disorder ever seen. Did you ever seen a fireball speed farther than 10,000 tons? My biggest, nastiest, most explodious fireball disorder ever seen." The orcs collectively gasped. Gorgruk froze. "Wait. What?" Grimgutz grinned. "Ha, I like this idea." Weirdchank cracked his knuckles. "Da rules are simple. Me and Zogwart each summon da biggest Waaagh. Fireball we can." Zogwart grinned, showing his crooked teeth. "Whoever makes the biggest boom wins." The orcs cheered. The goblins, sensing impending doom, immediately started running for cover. Weirdchank grinned. Let's light place up." "Da Waaagh, magic showdown." Both shamans stomped forward, their staffs crackling with raw green energy. The orcs gathered in a massive circle, chanting and stomping, their Waaagh energy building with every second. And then the fireball contest began. Weirdchank's fireball. Weirdchank raised his staff, green lightning sparking across his fingers. A massive, swirling ball of green fire formed in the air above him. It grew larger and larger, pulsing with raw power. Gorgruk grinned. He has the biggest fireball I ever seen. But before he could gloat, Zogwart's fireball, Mad Zogwart, not about to be outdone, screamed at the top of his lungs. "Walk. Mega fireball." And then, with a deafening crack, his spell exploded outward. And the entire sky turned green. His fireball wasn't just bigger. It was a roaring, swirling, out-of-control vortex of whack, magic that blotted out the sun. The orcs stared in awe. The goblins fainted. Gorgruk narrowed his eyes. "That might be too big." Grimgutz nodded. "Yeah, definitely too big." Then they heard the ground rumble, and the entire war camp fell silent. "Oh, what? Did we wake up?" Weirdchank, still laughing manically, froze mid-cackle. Did anyone else hear that? Then, from the far side of the valley, something massive stirred. Boom. The orcs looked around. What was that? Boom. A shadow rose from behind a ridge, blotting out the sky. Boom. Then, in a single earth-shaking roar, the ground split apart, and from the depths of the Badlands, something woke up. The biggest, angriest rogue giant ever seen. A massive, hulking, ancient rogue giant, long thought to be dead, rose to his full height. His skin was covered in scars, his bones creaked, and his beady red eyes gleamed with fury. And then, with a voice so deep it rattled the orc's teeth, the giant bellowed, "Ooh, dog, Zog woke me up." The orcs froze. Weirdshank slowly lowered his staff. Oops. Da battle against Da really big lad? Before anyone could react, the giant ripped a boulder from the ground and threw it straight at the orc camp. It smashed through 3 tents, a squig pen, and at least one very unlucky goblin. Gorgruk roared, "All right, boys. New game, who can crump GINT first?" The orcs cheered. Grimgutz grinned. "Ha! Now this is a contest. Da battle of the century, or at least the dumbest one yet." The orc warband surged forward, charging the enormous rogue giant with everything they had. Some highlights of the utter chaos that followed. One orc ran up the giant's leg, only to get swatted like a fly. A squig tried to bite the giant's toe and immediately regretted it. Weirdshank cast another fireball, which exploded in his own face. A particularly brave goblin threw a rock at the giant's head, screamed, "Take that!" and was immediately stepped on. Grimgutz and Gorgruk both climbed onto the giant's shoulders, punching and biting his ears while arguing over who was doing more damage. For over an hour the battle raged, and finally, with a massive, ground-shaking crash, the giant fell. Gone. Prompt. The orcs erupted into cheers, and Gorgruk and Grimgutz, both covered in bruises, burns, and squig bites, stared at each other, breathing heavily, covered in dirt, and realizing at the exact same time, "Wait a minute, who won?" Snicksnag, barely alive, flipped through his record book. "Feeling, let me check." The warbosses leaned in. The orcs waited, and then Snicksnag sighed. "It's a tie." Silence. Then, "What will change you?" "Happier." Both warbosses tackled each other, fists flying, kicking, headbutting, rolling across the dirt in a furious rage. The orcs cheered. The goblins ran. And somewhere in the realm of the Waaagh, Gork, or Mork, was watching all this, laughing his tusks off. Chapter 17. The Giant Smashing Contest. The rogue giant was still very much alive, and very, very angry. After being blasted awake by the biggest Waaagh fireball ever seen, the massive, scarred-up beast had decided that everything in sight needed to be smashed. Unfortunately for both warbosses, that included their entire camp. Olai, new contest. As the giant tore through tents, smashed wagons, and kicked over squig pens, Gorgruk Eadbasha and Grimgutz Irontoof had the exact same idea at the exact same time. They both stood up, battered and bruised from their last fight, and bellowed, "You crops, who giant first?" The orcs exploded into cheers. The goblins, who were already running for their lives, did not stop running. Weirdshank de Wizard, rubbing his temples, groaned. "Oitis is a bad idea." Snicksnag, scribbling furiously in his record book while dodging debris, whimpered, "Bosses, maybe we should use..." He was immediately kicked into a pile of wreckage. The contest had begun. The giant wrecks everything. The rogue giant, completely ignoring the fact that he was now part of a game, continued his path of destruction through the war camp. One orc tried to climb up the giant's leg, only to be kicked so hard he landed in a different time zone. The goblin, thinking himself clever, tried to stab the giant in the toe, but the giant accidentally stepped on him before he could finish. A squig, confused and scared, bit the giant's ankle, only to be yeeted into the horizon. Weirdshank cast a spell to slow the giant down. Instead, it just made him angrier. Meanwhile, both warbosses charged in. Gorgruk, vs. Grimgutz. Who can crump harder? "Bring someone to my presence immediately," Gorgruk roared, swinging a massive club at the giant's knee. "No, ain't," Grimgutz snarled, hurling a barrel of stolen dwarf explosives at the giant's head. Both attacks landed at the same time. The giant staggered, roaring in fury. Then, in pure, mindless rage, it swung both of its massive arms, sending both warbosses flying through the air. They crashed into separate parts of the camp, destroying multiple tents on impact. For a few seconds there was silence. Then Gorgruk and Grimgutz both stumbled back up, and both immediately charged at each other instead of the giant, fighting each other while also fighting the giant. Instead of working together to take down the rampaging mountain of muscle and bad breath, the warbosses spent most of their time punching each other while trying to land the finishing blow. Grimgutz tried to stab the giant's leg, but Gorgruk punched him in the ribs before he could land the hit. Gorgruk tried to smash the giant's head, but Grimgutz tripped him at the last second, causing him to faceplant. A goblin was about to hit the giant with a tiny spear, only to be kicked away by both warbosses for getting in the way. All the while, the giant continued smashing, kicking, and wrecking every part of the war camp. It was only a matter of time before something really stupid happened. And of course, something really stupid happened. The giant takes a wrong step. By now, the orc camp was completely destroyed. The only thing left standing was a single, poorly built wooden watchtower at the edge of a cliff. The giant, too caught up in smashing things, didn't notice that it had stomped its way to the very edge of the camp. It lifted one massive foot and took one very unfortunate step. The ground cracked. The orcs froze. The goblins stared in horror. The giant wobbled. And then, with a slow, comical expression of realization, it tipped backward and plummeted off the cliff. End of Dagyan smashing contest. For a solid minute, the warband stared at the empty space where the giant used to be. Then, in the distance, a loud thud echoed from the canyon below. Dust rose from the impact. The orcs blinked. Gorgruk snorted. "Ha! That was a good crumpin'." Grimgutz grinned. Yeah. But he turned to Snicksnag, who had barely crawled out of a pile of rubble. "Oi, Gobbo, who hit that last blow?" Snicksnag, still dizzy from getting thrown around all day, flipped through his battered record book. He squinted at his notes. "Neither of you actually hit the final blow." The warbosses froze. Snicksnag gulped. The giant just kind of fell. The camp fell silent. Then, another zogging tie? The orcs burst into laughter. The goblins groaned. Gorgruk stomped forward, cracking his knuckles. "Right. No more games. We end this now. Let us have..." Grimgutz grinned, already raising his fists. "Be her. I thought you'd never say it." And just like that, the final showdown was about to begin. Chapter 18. The Last Stand. Who gets the biggest boss fight? The orc war camp was gone. The giant was crumped. And now, every enemy they had pissed off in the last few weeks was finally catching up to them. From the west, the Empire army marched forward, their banners waving in the wind. From the east, the dwarfs stomped toward them, their cannons already aimed. From the south, Wobwaskragfang and his army of Black Orcs charged, roaring for revenge. It was a full-blown gitstorm. And in the middle of it, 2 orc war bosses too stupid to be worried. Who gets to fight first? Gorgruk Eadbasha and Grimgutz Irontoof stood on a rocky hill, surrounded on all sides. The 2 bosses looked out at the armies. Then, at the same exact moment, they both grinned. Grimgutz cracked his knuckles. Oi, Gorgruk, looks like we finally did it. Gorgruk raised an eyebrow. Did what? Grimgutz spread his arms. We finally got every single git in the Badlands to come fight us at the same time. Gorgruk thought about it for a second. Then his grin got even wider. Yeah, we did. The two bosses turned to their warband. The orcs pounded their weapons together. The goblins tried to dig a hole and hide. Weirchankta was outside. I hate the swag. Then Gorgruk pushed Grimgutz aside. All right, listen up, ya gots. I'm gonna crup day humies first. Grimgutz shoved him back. The hell you are. I get first, crump, Gorgruk snarled. No, I do, Grimgutz roared. Ya wanna fight about it? Both warbosses immediately tackled each other, fists flying, right in front of three approaching armies. Meanwhile, in the Empire army, General Ludwig von Kessler stood at the front of his army, sword raised, watching the greenskin camp in the distance. Behind him, hundreds of knights, gunners, and artillery crews stood ready. They had chased these orcs across the Badlands for weeks. They had suffered humiliation, destruction, and a town being turned into rubble. Now it was finally time for revenge. Ludwig turned to his men. Men of the Empire, he shouted. We face the most. Then he froze, because instead of organizing their forces for battle, the two warbosses were punching the ever-living hell out of each other. What? Ludwig muttered. The Empire troops stared in confusion. A knight rode up next to Ludwig. Sir, do we wait for them to finish, or? Ludwig rubbed his temples. Sigmar's mercy, I hate greenskins. Meanwhile, in the dwarf lines, Thane Durgan Ironhelm stood at the front of his dwarfs, glaring at the battlefield. They had brought cannons, grudge-throwers, and all the grudges ever written against these orcs. Today was the day of reckoning, the day of vengeance, the day where— Wait, one of his warriors said. Are dad orcs fighting each other? Durgan squinted. Sure enough, Gorgruk and Grimgutz were rolling around, smashing each other's heads into the dirt, completely ignoring every enemy army surrounding them. A grunt nice beard, Durgan muttered. I have never seen anything this stupid. A nearby dwarf nodded. Do we still shoot 'em? Durgan sighed. Aye, fire the cannons. Meanwhile, in Warboss Scragfang's Black Orc army, Scragfang, still furious over his camp getting looted, his best loot getting stolen, and the orcs being generally terrible at sneaking, stood at the front of his massive army of elite Black Orc warriors. Today was the day. The day he finally— Wait, what does Zogade doin'? He watched as the two war bosses, instead of preparing for battle, were instead slamming each other's heads into the ground. Are they even a Zogan boss fight before we fight 'em? Scragfang muttered. A black orc next to him scratched his head. Boss, does that mean we gotta wait? Scragfang growled. Nah, we crumped a lot of 'em. The armies finally attack. The Empire cannons fired. The dwarfs opened up with their grudge throwers. The black orcs stormed forward, roaring for blood. And in the middle of all of it, Gorgruk and Grimgutz kept punching each other. Weirdshank Dawazad grabbed Snicksnag and shook him. It's bloody write us down. Yayash, we's in the biggest battle of the century. Snicksnag, already halfway through his fifth nervous breakdown, scribbled furiously. Who's wyvern? Gorgruk bellowed, as he headbutted Grimgutz. Grimgutz bit his arm and laughed. Me? Ya git. Then an Empire cannonball landed next to them, blowing up half a dozen orcs. Both warbosses froze. Then, in perfect unison, they turned to face the oncoming armies. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then, "Well, I guess we gotta comp dem first." "Yay, I guess we do." The two warbosses stood side by side, weapons in hand. And then, as the Empire, the Dwarfs, and the Black Orcs all charged at the same time, they both grinned. Well, Chapter 19, Waaagh vs. Waaagh. The Empire soldiers, the Dwarfs, and Warboss Scragfang's Black Orcs all charged forward, weapons raised, ready to wipe out the greenskin menace. But before they could reach them, the Orcs turned on each other. The dumbest civil war in Orc history. The second Gorgruk Eadbasha and Grimgutz Irontoof finished punching each other, they both snarled and turned to their warbands. "Allayed, boys," Gorgruk bellowed. "Today we settle who day best warlord is on sen for all." Grimgutz cracked his knuckles. "That's right. Iron Stomper, get ready to The Orcs cheered. The Goblins screamed. And before a single human, Dwarf, or Black Orc could reach them, the two warbands charged at each other instead. Meanwhile, in the Empire army, General Ludwig von Kessler was ready for battle. He had waited weeks for this moment. The Orcs had burned his towns. The Orcs had humiliated his soldiers. The Orcs had, wait. He froze, because instead of fighting his army, the Orcs were fighting themselves. His second-in-command rode up beside him. "Sir, should we attack?" Ludwig blinked. Then he sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "No. Let's see where this goes." Meanwhile, in the dwarf lines, Thane Durgan Ironhelm gritted his teeth. "Nah! We've got 'em, lads," he roared. "Fire, da!" Then he stopped, because, just like the humans, he realized the Orcs were too busy fighting each other to notice the actual battle. A nearby dwarf scratched his beard. "Boss, do we still attack?" Durgan, now massaging his temples, sighed. "Hold the cannons. Let's see if they kill each other first." Meanwhile, in Warboss Scragfang's Black Orc army, Scragfang was furious. "All right, boys, we ca home." Then he stopped. He blinked. Wait. Are the Zog and Gits fighting each other? The Black Orcs looked at the battlefield. Sure enough, instead of fighting their enemies, the two Orc warbands were in the middle of a full-blown, no-rules, all-out Waaagh. Civil war. One of Scragfang's Black Orcs scratched his head. "Boss, do we still, fight 'em?" Scragfang thought for a moment. Then he sat down on a rock. "Nah, let's see what happens. The da battle of da biggest Waaagh." For the next hour, instead of fighting any of their actual enemies, the Red Skulls and the Iron Stompaws completely destroyed each other. Some highlights included an Orc trying to, strategically, throw a Goblin like a spear, only for the Goblin to miss and hit another Orc instead. A Squig caught in the chaos, running in circles while Orcs kicked it back and forth like a football. Weirdshang Dawazard firing Waaagh, lightning at Zogwit, who deflected it into a pile of barrels, causing an explosion that sent goblins flying. Snicksnag still trying to keep track of the fight, getting stepped on at least 5 times. Gorgruk and Grimgutz wrestling in the mud while still arguing over who's winning. At one point, an Empire knight, watching the mayhem, turned to General Ludwig. "Sir, I have no idea what's happening." Ludwig, leaning on his sword, sighed. "Neither do I." A dwarf cannon crew, having waited patiently for orders, looked to Thane Durgan. "Sir." Durgan rubbed his forehead. "Just let them fight." The Lost Orc stand-in. After another half hour of pure chaos, the battlefield was a disaster. Most of the orcs were either knocked out, too tired to fight, or laughing too hard to continue. The goblins, all hiding. The only two still fighting? Gorgruk and Grimgutz. Covered in blood, bruises, and Squig bite marks, the two warbosses kept punching, biting, and slamming each other into the dirt. Neither one was willing to fall. Neither one was giving up. Then they both raised their fists at the exact same time. They both swung at the exact same time, and they both landed a final, crushing punch to each other's jaws at the exact same time. Both warbosses staggered. Both warbosses blinked. And then, at the exact same time, they fell, flat on their backs, completely unconscious. The orcs stared. The goblins peeked out from their hiding places. And from the Empire lines, Ludwig von Kessler lowered his sword and muttered, "Heavenly, who won?" A long silence filled the battlefield. Then, slowly, Snicksnag crawled out from under a pile of debris. He limped toward the two fallen warbosses. He flipped through his battered record book. The orcs gathered around. The goblins held their breath. And then, I think it's another tie. The final showdown is set. At that exact moment, both Gorgruk and Grimgutz's eyes snapped open. They jumped to their feet. They looked at each other. And at the exact same time, the orcs exploded into cheers. The goblins groaned in despair. Weird Shank, now completely exhausted, sat down on a rock. "This is never going to end." Snicksnag, clutching his book, whimpered. "Well, what's the last round gonna be, bosses?" Gorgruk and Grimgutz, both wiping blood from their mouths, grinned. Da spite. And at that moment, the final round was set. One last battle. One last contest. And this time, there was no way it could end in a tie, right? Chapter 20. Who's the real warboss? After weeks of madness, destruction, and the dumbest competitions ever held in the Badlands, it all came down to this. No more contests. No more ties. No more gobbo-kicking, giant smashing, or stunty bashing. It was time for the final boss fight. The final battle begins. Gorgruk Eadbasha and Grimgutz Irontoof stood on opposite sides of the ruined battlefield, both bruised, battered, and absolutely furious. The Empire army, the Dwarfs, and Warboss Scragfang's Black Orcs all stood in stunned silence, watching the two warbosses face off. A single gust of wind blew through the wasteland. Somewhere a goblin coughed. Then, both bosses charged at each other. Fists flew. Teeth cracked. Mud and blood splattered across the battlefield. Gorgruk landed a bone-shattering headbutt. Grimgutz countered with a devastating uppercut. They tackled each other, rolling through the dirt like two massive, enraged squigs. Weapons were forgotten. This was just raw, brutal, orcish violence. The orcs cheered. The goblins took bets. The humans, dwarves, and black orcs just watched, completely baffled. Meanwhile, among the Empire troops, General Ludwig von Kessler, after weeks of chasing these lunatics across the Badlands, was at his limit. He turned to his second-in-command. So let me get this straight. Yes, sir. These orcs, who we have been hunting for weeks, are now fighting each other? Yes, sir. So we don't even have to fight them anymore? It appears so, sir. Ludwig rubbed his temples. I need a drink. Meanwhile, in the dwarf ranks, Thane Durgan Ironhelm had never been more confused in his life. One of his warriors cleared his throat. Professor? Durgan sighed. Are we still supposed to be fighting them? Durgan stared at the two warbosses tearing into each other and sighed deeply. Let's just watch this unfold. Meanwhile, with warboss Scragfang, leader of the Black Orcs, folded his arms. One of his boys stepped forward. "Boss, do we crump 'em now?" Scragfang watched as Gorgruk suplexed Grimgutz into a pile of goblins. "Nah," he muttered. "Dis is the best entertainment I've seen in years. Da big finish, sorta." The fight raged on for what felt like forever. Both warbosses were exhausted, covered in bruises, and barely standing. Gorgruk panted, swaying on his feet. "Like hell they would," Grimgutz wheezed, blood dripping from his nose. "I ain't down yet." And then the rogue Squig exploded. Nobody knew where it came from. Maybe it was one of the Squigs from earlier. Maybe it had been watching the fight and got too excited. Maybe it just wanted to cause problems. But whatever the reason, at that exact moment, a massive, earth-shaking explosion rocked the battlefield, sending both warbosses flying in opposite directions. Gorgruk landed headfirst into a broken cart. Grimgutz crashed through a half-burned tent. And just like that, both bosses were completely unconscious. When they woke up, hours later, Gorgruk groaned and sat up. His entire body hurt. He rubbed his head, blinking groggily. "Ugh, what happened?" Then he noticed something. The battlefield was empty. The Empire army? Gone. The Dwarfs? Gone. The Black Orcs? Gone. And worst of all, most of his own boys were gone, too. At that exact moment, Grimgutz groaned from the other side of the battlefield. He sat up, cracking his neck. "Oi, where's the fight?" Both warbosses looked around. A few orcs were still loitering nearby, mostly looting bodies and cooking squigs over a fire. But the vast majority of their warbands had wandered off. Some probably joined Scragfang's Black Orcs. Some probably got lost and started their own mini Waaagh. And some probably just got bored and left. Gorgruk and Grimgutz locked eyes. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Gorgruk scratched his head. "What's that score?" Grimgutz blinked. "Nothing, it's draw." Silence. Then both warbosses started laughing. Same time next year? As the sun set over the ruined battlefield, Gorgruk and Grimgutz sat by the fire, chewing on burnt squig meat. After everything, the competitions, the fights, the dumbest bets in orc history, it had all ended in a draw. Gorgruk grinned. "Guess that means we gotta have a rematch." Grimgutz chuckled. "Yeah, but next time we get bigger boys." Gorgruk nodded. "And bigger Squig, and big islet, and maybe less stunties and humies trying to kill us." Grimgutz paused. Then they both burst into laughter again. And just like that, the next big bet was already in the making.